Hello and welcome to Lady Dynamite Creates. This is Tiffany and today I will be working on my very first YouTube collab. I was invited by Crystal's Fantasy to participate in a demon collab along with Blurred Colors Art, Cloud Dolls, Dimonza Craft, Jackie O, The Hatter Dolls, Harley's Dollhouse, Josephine's Creatures, Kay's OOAK Factory, Crystal's Fantasy, and Steffo Doll. After you give my video a watch, be sure to check out their channels to see some truly fantastic creations. I'll have links to their channels in the description box below. So now let's get started. I decided I wanted my demon to be a roller derby girl. I first started coming up with names because roller derby names are always super fun, and I had a whole list and I was telling my husband my ideas, and when I landed on Bambi Brawllipop, he said, yes, that's the name, and you need to give her a mace that's shaped like a lollipop. Of course, that is 100% yes. I love the idea. So, enough talking, let's get on to the doll. Part of the collab guidelines were that we use a 17-inch doll, so you can see I am using this massive 17-inch Calliope. I start prepping her like I normally would, and I use my electric shaver to shave down all of her hair. However, that's about where the similarities end. I've seen from other customizers that these 17-inch dolls are a nightmare to get the heads on and off of, and that you're more likely to break the doll. So I decided I would just make my life easier by using an X-Acto blade and cutting a hole into the top of the head. This way I still get the access that I need without the headache. Here you can see instead of knotting or gluing the hair, they've melted it instead. I start removing all of the hair plugs and I'm taking my pliers and just ripping out the big chunks. I pretty quickly switched over to using the tweezers instead because once I got the big chunk of the part line out, the pliers were just having a little bit harder time grasping the smaller plugs, so with the tweezers I could get them a bit better. Using 100% acetone, I remove all of her factory paint. Now for the most time-consuming thing, addressing those drips. My demon girl, of course, does not need drips all over her body, so I have to get all of these off. I first tackle the ones on her head because of the softer vinyl. It does make them a little bit easier to be removed with just the X-Acto blade. So I take and I have a very sharp X-Acto blade and I start shaving off pieces just a little at a time. And eventually I get them nice and smooth. The body, of course, is a whole nother beast. Not only are the drips more pronounced, but there's a lot more of them. To remove the bulk of the drips, I'm using my Dremel with a plastic brush bit that is used for polishing metal jewelry. I'll leave a link for this in the description box. It's one of my favorite bits to use, especially on the doll bodies, because it's not as abrasive as some of the other bits are, and it doesn't leave as many scratches in the surface. However, it is important that you move this bit up and down and not in the circular motion, because if you go with the rotating of the bit, it's going to leave furrows in the plastic. Remember your safety gear too. Put those safety glasses on and wear that respirator. It's always better to be safe than sorry. Now to start on the hand sanding to get it nice and smooth. I first do a pass of 220, then follow that with 400 and 600 before I call it quits. Now this is kicking up a lot of dust, so you do want to make sure that you're wearing your respirator. You really don't want to be breathing in all of this plastic particles and dust. My demon of course needs some horns, so let's get sculpting. I'm busting out the epoxy sculpt and I'm mixing up equal portions of A and B. I make sure to wear my gloves while I'm mixing it, but once I get started on the sculpting, I am going to toss these aside. Epoxy Sculpt only recommends the gloves while the mixing phase is going on, but if you do have an allergy to this, you probably want to wear the gloves throughout the whole thing, but I know from past experiences that I'm fine. I've taken my clay and I've divided it into 2 equal portions, and I'm just going to roll it out with my hands into 2 tapered cones. I was having a bit of trouble with my clay sticking to my surface as well as my hands, so I have sprayed a bit of mold release onto those, so that's why it looks a little bit gross. Once I have the general shape, I'm going to embed a magnet into the larger end of the clay. Now to position these horns and to give them their final shape. I position the horns onto the doll's head and begin to shape them. When I'm happy with the position, I begin smushing the base of the horn into the doll's head. Because the epoxy is still soft and a little bit sticky, it sticks to the head of the doll without its corresponding magnets. However, to keep the epoxy from deforming as it cures, I am going to have to prop it up a bit. I set this aside and let it cure for 24 hours. With the epoxy fully cured, I'm going to secure some magnets inside the head as well. I realize that the neck peg is going to be in my way, so I do need to trim this down first. Once it's trimmed and out of the way, I'm going to mix up some epoxy and smush it down onto the magnets themselves. Now I'm going to do a detailing pass on the horns. I've marked down the front and back with lines so that I can see that more clearly while I'm working, and I've also marked where I want to have ridges. I apply a small rolled out portion of epoxy along those lines, and I begin using my fingers and tools to smooth them down. I'm only smoothing down one side so that I create a little bump on the other. I use my needle carving knife to add some texture. I just continue this method row by row all the way down to the bottom. I've actually wanted to make a roller derby doll for quite a while now. I used to want to try out for roller derby, and when I was younger I skated constantly. People around the neighborhood knew me as that little girl that was always skating. I remember being so mad at my mom because the road on the corner about 5 houses down from us got paved, and she wouldn't let me go down there and skate on the new pavement. Throwing you under the bus, Mom. Everybody knows now. The nice thing about using magnets is once I get down to where I can't hold the horn any longer, I can just stick it onto something metal and let it hold itself up while I sculpt. Once I'm happy with the sculpt, I do set these aside to cure for another 24 hours. I can now move on to the painting, and I begin by bathing these out in a pink that matches the same skin tone as Calliope. I'm using a dual action gravity fed airbrush to apply this paint. I'm alternating between blowing paint and blowing just air so that I don't create drips. I did have a bit of trouble with the horns twisting and not staying in place, so I created some bases for the horns to sit in on the head, and that solved that problem. But of course they need to be painted too, and I'm quite proud at how well I was able to match her color. Now I'm going to give the horn some shading, and I've just mixed up a color that's slightly darker than what I was using, and I do a few passes of this and then keep darkening as I go. Now moving on to the most fun part of this custom, her clothing. I start out with her fishnets, and I've cut out my pattern pieces, and with right sides facing, I'm going to sew down the front seam. Next, I sew in a waistband. I fold down the top, and I'm trapping a piece of elastic into the center there. However, I'm not going to be sewing directly on that elastic, just a tube around it. Once in place, I can cut off the excess and sew up the back seam. Now with right sides facing, I'm going to sew up the leg and crotch seams. Moving on to her shirt, I gather the top edge of her sleeve, and boom, new sleeve shape. I am going to apologize because I kept changing my mind in changing this. But I take that gathered sleeve and I'm going to attach it to the armhole of the shirt. And you'll notice I'm using the wrong side of the fabric. I really liked this color, but I didn't like the shininess of the one side, so I'm using the back side instead. With the sleeves attached and finally deciding on a shape, I am going to hem them. If I'd have decided earlier, I could have done this before attaching them. I'm also going to be hemming around the neckline and the top of the ties. I apply a layer of fabric fusion glue and I spread that out thinly. I then fold over the edge, and I'm going to heat press this down to seal it into place, and any areas that are curved, I'm going to clip so that they form a smoother hem. The pattern for the shirt, the shorts, and the skirt I digitized and made available for all of my patrons tiered cherry bomb it up. I wanted to say a big thank you to my friends over on Patreon. I really appreciate the support. B. Burnett, Oak Magpie, Beck's Mini Studio, Donna Magana, Stormcrow Studios, Kitsy, Camille, Angelica, Dollicious, Jennifer Medina, Angel Bookwalter, Amber S., Thury, Manders, and Deborah Sweeney. They get to see all of my works in progress and the behind-the-scenes stuff, including the failure to launch doll that was in between this doll and the last one. It was supposed to be a quick project, but it wound up not working out at all because I hated it. But they got to see that train wreck happen. If you're interested in being one of my patrons, please check out the link in the description box. I appreciate all the support. With the hems in place, I'm going to now sew up the side seams. I fold it so that the right sides are facing. I get the final bottom hem sewn in place, and then I begin on her decal on the back. I decided the name of her roller derby team was the House Bells and designed a custom logo for her team. I cut these from iron-on vinyl using my Cricut, and I'm applying them to the back of her shirt. I've made this logo available to all of my patrons in case someone wants to make a teammate. It came out so freaking cute and I absolutely love it. Now let's move on to her shorts. I'm using a faux stretch leather and I'm going to sew the fronts to the backs along the side seams. I'm using a walking foot on my sewing machine because sometimes sewing faux leathers can be a bit tricky and this just helps to pull the fabric through. I layer these two pieces with right side spacing and I sew down the front and the back seam. Because this fabric has some stretch, I don't have to worry about a closure in the back. I flattened down all of my seams using some super glue. I have found that fabric glue doesn't really work well with the faux leather backing, but super glue works just fine. I sew up the crotch seam and then I start adding the decals to her booty. I've cut handprints out of the iron-on vinyl, and because of the curvature of the doll's butt, I have these on the doll while I'm applying them. I give them a quick press while on just to get them tacked down and then more securely fasten them later after I pull them off. I've created a custom fabric for her skirt that's a distorted check print pattern. I gather up the inside edge of the circle skirt and I'm going to be attaching this to the bottom edge of the waistband. If you're interested in a more in-depth look at how I make my custom fabric, be sure to check out my strawberry shortcake video. I then apply a Velcro closure to the back. Now for the fabric bases for her elbow and knee pads. They're basically just tubes, but I need to hem the top and the bottom, and I suck at hemming stretch fabric. Luckily, I saw in a very recent video by Enchantarium that they used some fusible hem tape that is stretchy. I had never heard of this before, so I had to try it out, and let me just say it works fantastically. I simply follow the directions on the packaging and apply it to the top and the bottom of these pieces of fabric. I love that this stuff still stretches. It's just like a game changer. Where have you been all my life? Now I pull right side spacing and I'm going to sew up the back seam. Now we're going to move on to accessories and we're going to start off with her helmet. For the base of her helmet, I'm using one of those acrylic spheres that are the fillable ornaments at the craft store. I've cut off the hanging bit and I am heating it up and I'm going to form it to a more oval shape that matches her head. I've marked the areas where her horns will be, and I'm cutting those areas out with my Dremel. This is why it was important that her horns be on magnets. It would make it easier to take the helmet on and off, so I can take the horns off, place the helmet on, then put the horns back on. Because I'm using my Dremel, I am making sure to wear my respirator mask as well as my goggles. You don't want to catch a piece of flying plastic into the eye, and you certainly don't want to breathe in this melted plastic fumes and dust. I protected the doll with some cling film and I'm placing the helmet back onto the head, and I'm going to start covering that plastic base with some Worbla. I heat my Worbla up and begin to drape it over and stretch and pull and roll it out until it's nice and smooth. I cut away excess as I go. I sketch out the overall shape that I want around the ears and around the base of the neck. At that point, I realized I needed my helmet to come down just a little bit further, so I'm going to have to cut off another piece from the other half of the sphere and glue it in place. I use my Dremel tool to cut off the excess plastic around the bottom and give it a final cleanup. Now I can get it primed and ready for some painting. I first primed it with a couple of coats of Plasti Dip and then I began painting it with some acrylic paints. I paint a stripe down her helmet because I wanted her to play the pivot block position. That means she would start at the front of the pack and she would be the last line of defense to prevent the other jammer from scoring. Finally, I add in a strap using some ribbons, some jump rings, and a little tiny doll buckle. I referenced real helmets to see how the straps attached and were constructed. This way my straps can really function. You can never underestimate the importance of references. I've 3D modeled some knee and elbow pads, and I've gotten them printed up on my Elegoo 3 resin printer. I'm giving them a light sanding to remove any roughness left over from where my supports were. Once my surface is smooth and clear of imperfections, I give it a coat of black spray primer. Then, using acrylic paints, I apply in the rest of my color. I wanted to avoid having to mix the color up, and I found a craft paint that was in the shade that I wanted. However, it does require a lot of coats to get it opaque. When I'm finally done with all the layers of paint, I'm going to give just the turquoise area a coat of gloss varnish. With all the layers of paint finally finished, I can attach them to their sleeves. You'll notice that the area that I'm applying glue has no paint. I've discovered through trial and error that if you try to glue a 3D print that is painted, it's just going to come apart. I'm using a bit of cling film to protect the arm in case some of the glue seeps through. I'm also bending the arm a good bit to make sure I get good adhesion. Now for that lollipop shaped mace. I've 3D modeled this and I've printed it in clear resin and I've hollowed it out. However, the alcohol that I cleaned the resin prints with has clouded it up a bit. So I'm applying a layer of clear resin to the outside and I'm going to set that with my UV light. For the inside of the lollipop, I'm going to be mixing up 2-part epoxy resin. This is 1:1 ratio, so I'm just mixing up equal parts, and I am going to lightly tint this a pink color. I've left an opening in the bottom of the lollipop so that I can pour this back in. My idea was to give a swirl of white up through the center of the sucker, however, it did wind up sinking, and I noticed this before the resin had completely set, so I did go back in later and just mixed it all together. With the lollipop filled, I can now add in my wooden dowel. I'm using some tape to help hold it centered, as well as keeping it from sinking all the way in. I'll leave this to cure for 24 hours to fully set up. I paint the stick white and I've sharpened up the end so that I can easily fit a bead onto the tip. And I've chosen this iridescent star bead. Later off camera, I wound up adding a lime green glass bead. I felt like the end was a little bit lacking and this just fit in really nicely. The green bead wound up looking like candy too. Now for the most time-consuming part of this project. I modeled the skate bases in 3D Studio Max. I went for more of a hot rod look where the back wheel was a little bit bigger. Maybe a lot bigger. I'm in love with these and the printing turned out so great. I made patterns for the uppers and I've got them all cut out of my faux leather. I take my 2 main pieces and sew down the front seam. I glue down the seam allowance to cut down on bolt. I sketch out an area where I want some decorative stitching and I sew that using a contrasting color. After that, I can attach the tongue to the main body of the shoe. I pre-measure and mark where I plan to have the eyelets for the shoelaces. Once marked, I can take my awl and form holes for the eyelets to go into. I set the eyelets in place using my Fiskars tool. This is a new one for me and I have to say it's made a night and day difference. I'm no longer collapsing in my eyelets. I'll be sure to leave a link for this tool in the description box. A big thank you to Craftingness over on Instagram for the tool recommendation. She makes some really incredible and detailed World of Warcraft dolls. I highly recommend checking her out. With all of the details glued on, I'm now going to sew up the back seam. Now to actually get it all put together. I've taped a sole to the bottom of her foot, and I'm going to slide the upper part onto her foot and tighten it as it would be on her foot normally. Now I'm going to glue down all of these little jagged edges, and I start at the toes and then do the heels and then just work my way around. I am going to just skip towards the end because early on it is very hard to film and hold this in the right position to make sure that I'm getting it glued down evenly. With all of the edges now glued down, I can glue down a final sole. This is going to neaten up the bottom of the shoe and give me a smooth surface for gluing to the base. I couldn't resist just testing the fit and seeing how they're going to all look together. I'm really excited about these. Before I glue my uppers to my bases, I do want to get them painted first. So I've primed them in black paint, and then I can go in with my acrylic paints and give them color. Since I planned for my wheels to be pink, while I had my airbrush out to paint the horns, I painted them as well. Then I take a teeny tiny little brush and start painting in the Brawllipop letters with black. And at that point, I start regretting that I added this little detail. I liked it in the end, but painting each one of these letters was a pain in the butt. To assemble the skates, I'm going to be using super glue, beads, and wire. I wound up using the beads as little stoppers to keep the wheels from rubbing up against the side of the skates. If I had this to do over, I would design them just slightly differently, but I glue the beads in place and then glue the wires in, and once that one side is dry, I feed them through and then glue the other side. This way we have skates that really work. Finally, I can start gluing the uppers down to the bases. I'm really loving these skates, and I think they're some of the best shoes I've made. Because I wanted the doll to have real skates, it created the necessity for making these 17-inch bases. So now my Etsy shop does have some 17-inch bases and shoes available for purchase. I'm sorry it took me so long to get these available. I know it's been one of my most requested items. The last thing to do is lace these up. I'm using embroidery thread for laces, and I'm using a dental threader that's used for threading floss through braces to help me lace up the skates. We're finally starting the face up. Here's all the supplies that I used on this face up. Various brands of different watercolor pencils, some different pastels, as well as gouache paint in white and black, and some red acrylic paint. I've applied 3 layers of Mr. Super Clear UV Cut Flat. I wait about 30 minutes between each layer, and then I get to work. I sketch in the basic eye shape, and when I'm happy, I match it up on both sides. Then I begin defining pupil placement. I start with using dots to mark where the pupil is looking, and making sure they're looking in the same direction before I form the iris around them. And because the face I'm working on is so much bigger, I am going to sketch in the edge of the waterline here. I add in some pinks and red to the waterline. I darken up her upper eyeliner, and because I plan to start shading in with some pastels next, I'm going to cover her face completely with some colorless blender. This allows the pastels to slide on more smoothly and to blend better too. I always try to remember to do this first, but unfortunately I do forget a good bit. I start with a shade that's just slightly darker than her skin tone, and I begin contouring any of the areas that would naturally appear more in shadow. So the areas around her eyes, her nose, mouth, and around the ears and cheekbones too. I'm blushing her cheeks, and I'm using some bright red to do this so that it pops against her pink skin tone. Then using some Payne's Gray, I begin to smoke out her eyeshadow. I use my Caran D'ache Supercolor watercolor pencil to fill in the whites of her eyes. This is my favorite white watercolor pencil to use, and I prefer it over the pastel pencils because it doesn't leave behind that graininess. I darken up her lips and define some creases in there with my watercolor pencils and pastel. I apply some highlights to high points on the face with my pastel and my watercolor pencils. I've mainly focused around the eyes right now. After that, I start blocking in her eye color. I'm going for a golden honey color so that it has that yellow demonic feel to it, but it's still really pretty. I seal, and then I get started on layer 2, and the first thing I tackle are her eyebrows. My doll will have black hair, but because I'm a hot mess when it comes to doing eyebrows, I first go in with a darker brown. Then once I've refined them with my eraser and finalized the shape, I'm going to go in with some black and darken them up. Using various colors, I begin to add some details into her eyes. And because my eye canvas is bigger than I'm used to working with, I am trying to put in some more details than I normally do. I begin to add individual hairs to her eyebrows, and I'm just flicking these on in the direction of the hair growth so that they appear more natural. I do another highlighting pass across her face, and this one I'm focusing more on the face as a whole and not just in one section. I add in her eyelashes, and I'm going in with a harder leaded pencil so that I can get those nice delicate lines, and I'm using quick flicks of my pencil to get a nice taper. I do a dusting of pastel on top of the lashes to soften the look just a bit. And of course, anytime I work on a doll that's supposed to be a little bit more seductive, I can't resist giving her beauty marks. I don't know what it is, but I think it's what she needs. I felt like I hadn't done enough shading to the extreme parts of the face, so I'm darkening and defining some more of the areas around the ears and the nose. I get started on layer 3, and I do apologize. I thought I hit the record button, but I didn't before I painted in her eye black. For that, I've just used some black gouache paint, and I smeared it on with a paintbrush to have that painted on look. Then using white gouache, I can paint in her catch lights and highlights to her waterline. After I completed the highlights, I kept thinking she's missing something, and decided it was a bloody nose. I'm painting in a small rivulet of blood using red acrylic paint. With her face up finished, I can now move on to the body blushing. Because I had my airbrush out to paint the horns, I decided to go ahead and give the body a passing of body blushing with it too. So I'm just using the same colors I used on the horns to add some shadows to her body. I don't feel like I have as much control with the airbrush, so I didn't want to do 100% of the body blushing with it. After I've finished up with the airbrush, I'm giving her 2 coats of Mr. Super Clear, and then I'm going to get started using pastels and pencils too. I'm using the same colors that I've used on her face, and I'm focusing in on the areas where I couldn't get as detailed with the airbrush as I'd like to, like her hands. I use my watercolor pencil to add in some creases to the hands, and then I gently rub it to soften the lines. Once I'm satisfied with the body blushing, I give her 3 coats of Mr. Super Clear to be sure to seal in all of this work. I really don't want it rubbing off on her clothes or becoming damaged over time. I do a bit more body blushing after this, but I gave her nipples, and YouTube doesn't like nipples, so let's cut to the hairstyling. For her hair, I'm using this Yarn Bee Uber Luxe in black, and if you remember the yarn that I used on my Pirate Mermaid, it was a gift from another doll artist and I didn't know what kind it was. Well, it's this kind, so if you're interested in getting this kind of yarn, it's wonderful to use for hair. I cut up a long section and then I unwind all of the yarn pieces, and then I'm going to grasp the ends and just start pulling the fibers apart. And you can see this yarn looks absolutely gorgeous. I don't plan to flat iron it. I think this wave is gorgeous and want to keep it. So I jump right into making the wefts. I have this tile that I usually make wefts on, and I've drawn a line down it because it helps me keep my wefts straight. I take a small section of yarn and I lay it down on my tile and apply Mod Podge to just the tips to form the wefts. When the glue's had a chance to dry, I'm going to pull all of the wefts off. I trimmed down the glued edge, leaving about 1/8 of an inch of glue still left on the weft. Before I can apply her hair, I need to glue her head back together. I start with the fringe and I'm going to lay these down layer by layer. After each layer, I give it a trim to the desired length because I find it easier to trim it this way than all at once at the end. When the fringe is done, I'm going to get started on the back, and I've realized I forgot to paint the scalp, so I'm going to do that really quick before I move on. I apply this layer by layer just like I did in the front, only I am going in the opposite direction. However, when I get to the areas right around the horn bases and her part line, I'm going to flip it in the opposite direction so that when it folds back down it has a nice neat transition. Now to style the hair. I'm first going to cut off a chunk at the bottom because I don't want her hair to cover up the cute design that I made on the back of her shirt. Then I take my thinning shears and start clipping away around the bottom edge. This is going to make that area look a little bit more natural and not quite such a blunt cut. Once I finish up her haircut, she's all ready. I want to thank you all so much for watching this video, and if you liked it, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. Be sure to head over to all of my Collab Partners videos and give them a watch too. So you'll remember, this is where we started, and then here's our final results. If you're interested in Brawllipop, she will be available for purchase on my Etsy shop, so please check out the link in the description box. I really had a blast working on this doll, and I hope you guys enjoyed watching as much as I enjoyed creating it. A big thank you to all of my collab partners. I really appreciate being invited and hanging out with you guys in the chat. I'll see you guys next time. Remember, always be creating.